All right, Matthew chapter 12. I'm going to start in verse 43, but I want to remind us that Matthew, by the Holy Spirit, arranged his gospel in such a way that there are clear sections that are grouped together with a certain purpose. And as we're going through chapter 12, there definitely seems to be a storyline, what's going on, some themes that are happening, and we're getting to the conclusion of this section. So what we've seen so far is that this section starts with the opposition against Jesus becoming more sharp and more public, that there are guys accusing Jesus openly of breaking the Sabbath, challenging Jesus in the synagogue. There are guys accusing Jesus of being in league with the devil as he casts out demons. By the prince of demons you cast out demons. These kind of things. These things are being thrown at Jesus in public in front of other people. That is quite an opposition. Now Jesus, through this section, has been making proclamations about himself and declaring who he is. And so he's made clear that he is greater than David, greater than the temple, that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's stronger than the devil. He is way more than a teacher or any prophet has ever been. And so he's making this point, right? While they're accusing him, he's making this clear. This is happening in front of his disciples, those who are close to him and devoted to him, and then in front of, obviously, right in the face of the opposition, but also in front of the crowd of people, some inclined towards Jesus and some having no idea who this guy is. They're here just to see what's going on, to listen, what's all the fuss about. And so this is playing out in front of all of them. And Jesus issues a warning that you have to choose a side, that you have to be with me or against me. Jesus, this is all in Matthew 12. You have to choose a side. And so Jesus proclaiming his part, they proclaiming their opposition. And he gets to a point where he boldly, in front of all of these people, tell the Pharisees and those who oppose him what awaits them after this life. After this life, you will go to judgment, and the men of Nineveh will stand up and condemn you. Queen Sheba will stand up and condemn you because someone greater than Jonah is here. Someone greater than Solomon is here. I'm greater than all them, and you are rejecting it. And so he is really putting it to them. And this is where we pick up, because this is connected to that same conversation, and Jesus, having condemned them about what's going to happen to them in the afterlife, he continues in verse 43. Now, when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and does not find it. And then it says, I will return to the house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will also be with this evil generation. And while he was still speaking to the crowds, behold, his mother and brothers were standing outside seeking to speak to him. And someone said to him, behold, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak to you. But Jesus answered the one who was telling him and said, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, behold, my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and my sister and my mother. So Jesus, having told them what's going to happen to them in the afterlife, now starts to talk to them about what's going on in their life now. And so he makes this example of someone who has been demon-possessed and then set free from that bondage. It is not important whether there was an exorcist, who the exorcist was, or whether it was just that they got their act together finally and this demonic influence went away. But one way or another, they become clean. And having been cleaned, they remain empty. They don't fill their life with what they should, leaving that empty. Now, nature, including the spiritual nature, hates a vacuum, and where there's emptiness, something's going to be filling that emptiness. And so if they don't fill that emptiness, it's only a matter of time before that spirit comes back, recognizes that it's clean but empty, and he will reoccupy it and bringing worse influence with him, that the end of this person will be worse than the beginning, that his situation will only get worse. Now, Jesus says that is a spiritual thing that can happen to someone who's demon possessed. I want to make clear that it is a principle that applies beyond what we think of as the lunatic demoniacs. Like, it doesn't have to be, because we can easily dismiss that and go, meh, yeah, well, I'm not demon possessed. Actually, hardly know anyone demon possessed, and dismiss this whole kind of example that Jesus is putting out there. But it is a principle that is, it can apply to certainly someone who is demon possessed, but any of us who have been under the influence of a sin and then sobered up in the true spiritual sense, sobered up, cleaned up, if we don't replace what was there, if we leave that space empty, that part of our life empty, it won't stay empty. It's going to get something else into it. And so that you may have seen this played out. You may have played this out. When you see, someone who's, to start with the more obvious ones. You see someone who's got a drinking problem or a drug addiction, and they come to a place where they got pulled over, got arrested or something or other, and you think this is rock bottom, and they're sober, clear. They say, yeah, man, boy, that was a mess. I don't ever want to do that again. And they get clear-headed, sober-minded, and clean. And that's exactly the terminology you use when you got off the bottle or you've got off drugs. You say, I'm clean. It's exactly what Jesus said. It's clean. Your life is clean. But if it's still empty, you're just going to go back. If you don't fill it with something. And these are principles that recovery programs, secular and Christian definitely, but even secular ones, make a point. If you don't fill that space, you're going to go back. You've got to fill it with something. And so you seeing them get to that place, they don't fill it, and they just go back. And you go, I thought that was rock bottom. And they hit another, boom. Now they lost their job, lost this, lost that, and sober up and go, oh my gosh, they go to rehab or whatever and get clean. But they don't replace it with something, they're going back. And it's real. It's a real thing, and it's real to us. If you don't have that kind of problem, I'm telling you, it's real. If you've got, there's a whole country's worth of people who are religious in the sense that they cleaned up their lives. They stopped their drinking or they stopped their whatever, but they didn't fill it with actual Jesus. And so that emptiness got filled with self-righteousness and judgment. And you see those people and they're like, how did this happen? Like, well, yeah, they were clean and empty is what happened. They're clean, empty. The religion they're in, it didn't fill them. It just cleaned them. And they got clean, but they're empty. And now they're filled with self-righteousness and hatred and judgment, and they're doing nobody any good. Now, that That's real. If we think, even for, even taking it down, more, even if you just think to yourself, oh man, I hate this guy at work. And then you realize, I'm not supposed to hate the guy at work. You say, I'm going to stop hating the guy at work. And so you manage to maybe you can try to clean that. But that's not going to work. You know it's not going to work because you've tried it and it doesn't work. You can't just clean. You have to fill that space with love. You have to fill that space with mercy. You can't just stop hating someone. You've got to fill it with something because that emptiness is going to get filled with something. And it won't be better. So this principle is real. I want us to just acknowledge that. It's real and it applies to all of us. You cannot simply get clean of your sin. You can't get clean of your attitude. You can't get clean of your sin, your thoughts, your actions. None of those things. If you get them clean, but don't fill it with Jesus, you haven't gotten anywhere. So here we go. Jesus says that is a thing that happens to people. But he says, he applies it to this whole generation that he's speaking to. He says, you as a people have gotten clean. Now, so speaking of the Jewish people, they had, during the divided kingdom, they had fallen into idol worship and all kinds of nastiness. They were sacrificing children to Moloch and all kinds of ridiculous stuff was going on. And God sent them into exile, brought judgment on them, sent them into exile, and they got clean. And they came back from exile clean. Those people have never had that kind of nonsense again. But Jesus is saying, I'm here to fill that space. If you don't get this in you, you're going to be worse off present in this life. Well, he talked about what's going to happen at the judgment. I'm talking about now. This life is going to be ugly if you don't recognize that you're clean, great, but you're empty. You're supposed to be filled with this. The Messiah has come. Receive him. If you don't take this, if you don't recognize the gospel is being presented to you, and you with lights on, eyes open, recognize and say, nah, I think I'm cool, walk on your way, it's not going to go well. There are two things that can happen when word comes at you like that and you walk away from it. One is that the Lord will pursue you and make things harder on you so that you're kind of forced to face him, which can be a scary situation. Or a worse situation is that you don't hear from him again. That you ignore him when he comes to you, convicts you of sin, shows you his light and his love, and you walk away from it. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that he just lets you go your way. And you don't feel that conviction again. You don't want either one of those things to happen. When he comes, when the day comes, when he speaks to you and shines light in your life, when he convicts your heart, when he points to something in your life, do not harden your heart. Do not turn away. Submit to him. All right. So, having said that, he says to these people, you are clean, fair enough, but you're empty. If you don't receive this, things are going to get worse for this generation, this nation. And that's exactly what happened. Not long after the resurrection of Jesus, judgment came on Jerusalem in the form of the Roman Empire, not once but twice, destroying it the second time for good. 2,000 years trying to recover from that dispersion and desolation. And so, yeah, that's no joke. Jesus is telling them what's up. But this is important to recognize that this speaking of judgment and the speaking of the I don't know. I mean, in some way, the judgment in this life of turning away from the truth, it is connected. Verse 45 and 46 are connected. There was no numbers when this was written, certainly no headings. And it says, while he was still speaking. That's how that starts, right? So don't disconnect it from the last part. While he was still speaking, his mother and brothers come, and they're outside and wherever they are. They can't get through the crowd. Somebody doing a favor pushes through the crowd and gets up to Jesus, says, your mother and brothers are here. And he here is probably one of the most confusing things that he could have possibly heard. I mean, just not what I would have expected at all, and I doubt he would have. Jesus goes, oh, who are my mother and brothers? And the guy's like, if this was me, I'd be like, those people out there who just said they're your mother and brother. What do you mean? Like, what kind of question is that? But it seems obvious. Your mother and brother are your mother and brothers. Like, that's who they are. And Jesus says, points at his disciples, and this is mind-blowing, points at his disciples in this moment and says, here are my mother and brothers. The one who does the will of my Father, that is my mother, my sister, my brother. And Jesus says that even then, in the flesh, when Jesus, born of Mary and the Holy Spirit, so he has blood, DNA, that connects him to Mary, which his half-brothers are connected to him, and they are blood relatives to Jesus. And yet, in that day when he's alive, they're just outside the door, he will say, these people right here are closer to me, more intimate with me, more familiar, more family to me than those people by blood. Because these guys are submitted to the truth and they're living by my word. And how incredible is that? This is last week when there was a word that came and someone said they felt like the Lord was saying that there's, someone or some, persons that still felt like they had an orphan spirit, and in the sense that they didn't feel connected, even though they come to Jesus and been born again and what have you, still just feel disconnected and not really part of a family. And Jesus is saying that if you have come to me, that you're more surely a part of my family than even the blood relatives that he has. That there's, how incredible is that? You are part of his family. So let me just take a moment with this, that we should, I want us to appreciate this, that if you have submitted to Jesus, you have become part of the family. And maybe the first thing that comes to mind is the scriptures that say that you can be born again, right? So in John chapter 1, it says, as many as received him, to those he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. They are born again by the will of God. Born again speaks of your nature being changed. Your very nature is changed. And yet, as fantastic as that is, and important as that is, there are people who know for a fact that they are, blood related to their family, and yet still feel disconnected, and still feel rejected, and feel unwanted. And some sadly have been told that they were a mistake, that they weren't wanted, that they, didn't expect this one, and that's damaging, and some people still feel that way as they relate to the Lord, and in a kind of a messed up theology kind of way, they might think that God made an obligation to save anyone who prays this prayer, and He didn't have any say in who would say it or anything, so you may think that, well, I got one over on the Lord because I prayed the prayer and I gave Him my life, and now I'm part of the family, but He never really wanted me, and I'm a mistake. But that's not the way God works. That they were, it says there, even in first chapter of John, it says that it was by the will of God. It was a choice of God. And so let's move on to Romans chapter 8. I'll look at a verse in Romans chapter 8. You can turn there if you want. But the New Testament talks about us being born again, which has to do with the change of our nature, but it also talks about adoption, which seems odd to some, because isn't it better to be natural born than adopted? But here's something really special about this idea of it being adopted. And so let me look at Romans chapter 8 and verse 15. It says, "You have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God." The wonderful thing about this adoption is that there is no mistake that you were wanted. You were chosen. You clearly, the child doesn't pick the parent. Parents come in and choose a child. Adoption speaks of the will of God, the choice of God, the sovereignty of God. It had nothing to do with you. He chose you. And how wonderful is that? If you can accept that for what it is, it means you've been chosen. Make no mistake, you aren't here because you simply prayed a prayer that someone put out. You're here because God chose you, and you responded in a way that, I admit, hardly makes sense. Free will, sovereignty of God, I won't try to explain it. They just both exist because God said so. You prayed because you had to pray. You chose to pray, but you, my friend, weren't saved because of any action of your own, not because of any goodness of your own, not because of your will, His will. He chose you. You're not a mistake. You were planned by God. He picked you. I think that's important to just deal with. Just, you have responsibility for your free will decisions, absolutely. But make no mistake, God has a free will too. He chooses. He, by His will, chose you. So rejoice in that. Rejoice in that. He adopted you. He looked at you, saw you for who you are, and took you anyway. Amen. Knowing exactly what you'd do, how you'd act every day of your life. He chose you. And finally, let me make it clear with this. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. "See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God. And that is what we are. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. How great a love the Father has lavished on us, that we would be called children of God. Understand this. You are not in a family where you're not noticed. You're not in a family where you're not wanted. You're not in a family where you're not cared for. You are loved. How great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God. He loves you. That is who you are. The Gospel of John, and John never says who he is when he never identifies himself, except to say, the one loved by Jesus. That was his whole identity, just to know he was loved by Jesus. It's the only thing that was important in his life. His name was secondary to him. He was someone who was loved by Jesus. You ought to know that clear. You are loved. You are loved by Jesus. You are a child of God. You are not a cousin. You're not a nephew. You're not a grandkid. You are a child of God, a son and daughter. You are co-heirs with Christ. He counts you brother, sister. He looked at his disciples just like he would look at you, and he would point and say, here are my brothers, here are my sisters. That's who you are. You are not a mistake. You are not unwanted. You are loved, secure in his hand. And so, to get back, if I can, to the text. In Matthew chapter 12, he had said to them, you have to make a choice. You can be with me or against me. Against me looks like this. You will, after this life, go to judgment. And people will stand up and condemn you for the stupidity of rejecting me. And in this world, you will suffer, because life will not get better having rejected me. It's going to get worse. Or, look, this is my family. You could be part of this. This is my family, and you can be part of it. Anyone who would do the will of my Father, that is my mother, my brothers, my sisters. And that's the message of this section. To make clear that there's only two directions. And even as Moses, here I give you life and death, blessings, cursings. Choose. Jesus says, this is what it looks like to reject me. This is what it looks like to accept me. And I want to encourage every one of you that have accepted him. You should feel secure in that spot. Know that you're loved. Know that you'll always be cared for. Know that you'll never be separated from him. Know that you have his loyalty. And if there's anyone here who hasn't made that decision, I strongly encourage you. Life with Jesus is not better than life without Jesus. It's like finding out that life without Jesus wasn't life at all. Life with Jesus, it's different. You'll figure out what peace is, what joy is, what love is, what grace is, what mercy is. If you haven't known Jesus, you don't know what any of those things are. You've heard the words, but you've never felt anything like the real thing. I encourage you. If you want this morning to pray, to know him, raise your hand and we'll pray with you. If you're trying to figure it out, we'd be glad to pray with you.